The question I wanted to ask, meanwhile, we wait for a participant, is you mentioned riches are in the niches.
Oh yeah,
Are
I love
in So, can you clear that up a little bit, expand for me, please?
Sure. So this is really a marketing and a business principle. The more that you can hone in and focus on a particular aspect of something, it's going to get rid of the people that are not for you, whether that's your personal brand or your business brand. You really are looking to get the very specific audience that is looking for your solution. And if you think about you as a sole proprietor, if that is, what you are, I'm just using that as an example. But if you try to be too many things to too many people and serve everyone, you end up watering down your offering. So if you can have in your mind the exact person and what their issues and challenges are, you can come up with a specific solution for that person that is very specific and that they're going to find exceptional value for, that they will pay for. And you always want to have that in your mind. So when I say the riches are in the niches, it's all about that focus. And I find that many times, and I suffer from this myself, as women, we are wanting to please everybody, listening, trying to incorporate everything, and it is a path to mediocrity.
Thank you. We actually have a few questions coming up. One from Rhonda. It says, does a podcast need to be recorded in a recording studio?
So the answer to that question is no way. So I am here sheltering in place in my home. I do not have a podcast studio. Normally, I podcast from, I have a small office. I podcast from there. But now that I'm home and sheltering in place, I'm podcasting from my closet. So if you consider my closet a studio, there is then yeah, but no, you can literally podcast from anywhere. There is a variety of different equipment that you can use, and it is not expensive at all. And I can show you, and there's a million YouTube videos out there. But there are ways to set up your equipment and to get beautiful sound wherever you are.
All right. Thank you so much. The next question is from Mary. She said, once you have a podcast all set up and several episodes recorded, how do you get traction? How do you make it known that the podcast even exists? And that's a very, very good question.
A great question. So I know that that's a challenge, and that is a marketing challenge. It's like any other content. You need to share it. You need to build your audience and share your content. And it does require a marketing effort. You don't just create something and they shall come. You definitely need to be promoting this stuff. There are a million ways to do that, depending on where you're starting on social media, depending on what groups you're a part of on Facebook, depending on if you have your own, email marketing list. It is truly a marketing initiative, but it's content that really draws people in. This isn't an offer. This is a discussion about a topic or entertainment or whatever, but the podcasting medium is literally sitting in people's ears, and there's an intimacy that I believe is created with podcasting that you can't get anywhere else. And the other thing is when you launch a podcast, there's two things actually. When you launch a podcast, you want to have your podcast distributed on some of these larger podcast distribution services like Apple iTunes or Google Play or Stitcher. And so for each one of those networks, and there's a lot of them, for each one of those networks, you need to submit your podcast to those networks so that every episode that you release gets syndicated and put out there. So if somebody is looking on their podcast app on Apple iTunes, and if they're looking for a specific topic of a podcast to listen to, they're going to do a search, and then your podcast can come up in that search if you meet the search criteria. So you basically, at the minimum, want to be on some of the larger networks, and it's free to get onto these different distribution platforms, but it does require a little bit of back and forth. So the more networks that you're on, the more, exposure, that potential that you have. Now, the She Leads podcast network, one of the reasons that there are even podcast networks in general is because the person that has created that network does things to help the different hosts to market their show. And those are things like talk about it on their own marketing channels, cross-promote the other podcasts that are in the podcast network, and offer that, marketing advice and support to everybody that's on the network. I think one of the advantages that I have as a host, as a podcast network, provider, is that I have an extensive marketing background. I'm not just a podcaster, I'm a marketer. So I hope that thoroughly answers your question.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. Now, this question was sent in by someone. They wanted to know, what are some of the podcasts that you see that, are really getting tractions versus the ones that are not getting tractions?
I mean, it's difficult to almost look at it like that, because it's really what the objective of the podcast is. So if the objective of the podcast is to get as many listeners as possible, you can kind of look at some of the podcast rankings and say that podcast is doing really well. Like the Dave Ramsey Show, I believe, is like the #1 podcast on iTunes. And he talks all about personal finance, and he's actually awesome. But he has a million other different products and services and content that he offers. So his reason for having his podcast is to expose his other content to his audience. And, obviously the more audience that he has, the more opportunity he has to sell some of his other things to his audience. Now, somebody could have a very small audience and be killing it. So it really depends on what it is you are using your podcast for. When you say gain traction, I'm not sure if that means increase your listeners or have really high engagement with your listeners. So for example, let's say you are a really niche coach, okay, who, I'm going to just make something up. So you are a coach that helps people to organize their kitchen, their small galley kitchen. I'm being really niche, right? Their small galley kitchen. If you have 5 listeners and 4 of those listeners hire you as somebody to come in and redevelop the organization of your kitchen, and it's something that's super valuable to you, and your offering is that it's going to cost somebody a couple $1,000s to do that, well, to me, that is success. So it's really, what is your objective?
Okay. Thank you so much for that. Now, my other question, how do you make money from podcasting? Because, you know, it seems as if you're going to be spending money initially, but one wants to make a profit. So how can you make money from podcasts?
Yeah. And, not all podcasters want to make money. I mean, there are podcasts out there that show you how to draw, or teach you how to draw or paint or learn a language or just, talk about beer. Like, there's everything under the sun that's out there in podcasting. For people that are looking to make money from podcasting, there are a couple of different ways. There's advertising supported podcasts. So if you listen into a podcast and you hear, this podcast was brought to you by, MailChimp. I hear, it's not MailChimp, it's another one of the email service providers that I hear a lot. Or this podcast was brought to you. Those podcasts have reached out to those companies and said, hey, will you support my podcast by advertising on my show? And so advertising dollars is a way to actually monetize your podcast. But in order for some of these larger brands to want to advertise, they're going to want to see those huge numbers. You could make advertising available to anybody. So I could say to you, would you like to, if you were looking for exposure for your educational platform or your conference, you might say, hey, Adrienne, the people that listen to the Sugar Coated podcast are the exact people that I want to attend my event. And I could sell advertising to you. And that's how I could monetize my podcast a little bit. Right? It might be very worth it for you to spend a couple of $100s to support my podcast for, 2 weeks and get a lot of airtime, because it's going to drive people to your conference where you're going to make money. So there's the monetization of the podcast by actually trading dollars for advertising. And then there's also, what are you using your podcast for in order to get people to engage with your other products and services and offerings? Many times people are using the podcasting platform as a way to demonstrate their expertise, and then they give an offer to somebody to join their mastermind program or sign up for one of their courses. And so that's how they're monetizing their podcast. And there's one more way too. There's probably a multitude of other ways, but if you are somebody that has a relationship with any type of a company, you can actually do a whole entire series based on your relationship with that company. So if you have a relationship with, like, let's say a small business lender or something, that lender might underwrite, a series of 4 shows. And so it's not so much advertising. They're not asking for ads on your show, but they're saying, this series on financial wellness is brought to you by XYZ, financial underwriter. So, and those are just a couple of ways. I'm sure that there are many other creative ways for people to make money. It's really in the creativity.
Thank you so much for that. Now we have the last question that I'll be taking for this webinar, and it's from Laura. It says, how do you determine the cost of the supporter or sponsor?
So I think what they're asking is, how do you sort of price your advertising? And I would say that is something that is up to you. There is no formula. It depends on who you are, what type of audience your podcast has. If it's super niche, if the company is very interested in reaching your audience, they're going to want to pay more. If if you don't have anything that the company is going to offer, well, then it's not valuable to them. It's really in the negotiation and figuring out what works for you. And again, this is a case where if you're going to start a podcast, you need to know what your value is, and you need to try and get the maximum that you can and deliver exceptional value.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. Really appreciate this. And if anyone wants to contact her, the information she already gave, but you want to repeat it, Adrienne, how to contact you?
Sure. Thank you so much. So people can just visit the website, which is sheleadsmedia.com. And you can navigate to the podcast network and listen into some podcasts. I am going to be putting together a list of sort of my favorite podcasts and things that I listen to, because a lot of people have been asking me for that. So I can make that available on my website. But if you wanted to go ahead and send me an email, it's just Adrienne, ADRIENNE at sheleadsmedia.com. And I'm very responsive.
All right. Thank you so much. And thanks for our participants that joined us today, right? Everyone be safe. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.